Module 5, Part 1, Tips and Information Not to Include on a Resume. So with this lecture, we're going to start with some resume hints, and then we'll talk about some things not to include on your resume. Concrete nouns and active verbs are very important to have in a resume because they have a more intuitive meaning in the English language and are easily processed by the brain. So whenever you're got bulleted items for your job duties, you always want to lead off with an active verb. So things like designed, supervised, led, coordinated, that sort of thing. And so I'm going to jump over here to the CSU Career Center website, and I'm going to click on RAM Career Tools. And when we get to this part here, we've got a couple different options. We've got this heat map here, and we can click on certain items we want to look at more. And so the way the heat map works is the larger the words, the more frequently people have been clicking on these lately. You can also use this drop-down menu here on the left and specifically select certain things like, say, resumes or cover letters. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select resumes. And what this does is it brings up lots and lots of different resources. Now, as I slowly scroll down here, you'll see that there are many, many, many resources here. So keep in mind that it's not just these few things here. You've got to scroll down quite a bit. And these are the ones that have been viewed the most. And so as you scroll down, you'll find a lot more. Now, if you don't want to scroll down through everything, what you can do is go up here and you can type in a search. And so I'm going to look for active verbs. And that's going to give me some resources here, and if I scroll down I can find some links here, and some of these may be on the CSU Career Center's website, some of these might be on an external website from CSU. So for example, this takes us to livecareer.com, and it's got some action verbs, and these are categorized. So variety of different lists that are out there that are really helpful. So if you're looking for words that you can use to demonstrate something on your resume, looking for active verb lists is very helpful. Using phrases with bullets, we've kind of already talked about this a little bit, but bullets draw the eye to important text, and it makes it easier to read and comprehend than having complete sentences. Using columns for listing items, just a way to visually separate items. So for example, if you have a list of many things, like say titles of relevant coursework, or maybe skills or something like that, see if you can put those lists into 2 or 3 columns. One of the ways to do this in Microsoft Word is to use a table in Word, but just make sure that the lines for the table are hidden so they don't appear when you print the resume. But that's one way to guarantee that those columns are going to be straight and really aligned nicely. Always try to have your resume critiqued by a career counselor at CSU or someone like me, an internship coordinator. It's best if you can have somebody who's a professional in the field that which you're applying to look at the resume and give you feedback. Make sure your resume has a positive tone to it. Most people are going to write using positive language to begin with, but it's always good to have another person take a look at it. And then minimize or omit the negative. You don't want to, if something bad happened in another job, you don't want to talk about that. Of course, if a question comes up during a job interview and they ask, why do you not work there anymore or something, and if you got terminated, then you have to be honest about that. But you want to stress the positive and minimize the negative on your resume. And then, just like every cover letter is going to be specific to the job you're applying for, same thing with the resume, but you also want to make sure that it's focused in terms of your knowledge, your skills, your abilities, your education, things like that. Because if it comes across as scattered, you may be trying to say too many things on it. So if you're saying things on there that aren't really relevant to the job you're applying for, then it's probably something that doesn't need to be on there. So talking about things not to include, abbreviations, the exceptions to this would be the name of a degree. So for example, if it's a Bachelor of Arts or Bachelor of Science, you can abbreviate that as a BA or BS. The abbreviations for names, those would be the 2 capital letters. And then there's certain industry acronyms that are pretty common things like medical training, CPR, wilderness first responder, wilderness first aid, LNT for leave no trace, those sorts of things. You shouldn't include high school information unless it's specifically relevant to the job you're applying for, or if it's for a federal government job. So if you're doing a federal government resume, then you would include high school information, or if the job announcement requests it or requires that you include your high school information. So this would be things like you don't need to list your diploma, you don't need to list any jobs you had in high school, again, unless it was relevant to the job you're applying for now. If you're in college, it's understood that you have a high school diploma or you have your GED, so it's not needed on a resume. Other things not to include would be a reason for leaving your last job. If this comes up, it's typically requested in a formal job application, or sometimes they'll ask you during the interview process, so you don't need to state that on your resume. Most people agree that you shouldn't list narrow geographic preferences on a resume because that could limit your ability to get a job. Some people say if you are going to put geographic preferences on your resume, you might want to list that in a objective statement up at the top. And in that objective statement, you would talk about the type of job or jobs you're applying for, the type of industry, and then if you have any specific geographic preferences. Avoid using opinion words or extreme modifiers, and try to avoid using personal pronouns. So I, my, me, our. You can still say the same thing without using those words on a resume. And so if you use those words a lot, it comes across in some cases as egotistical. It's also more cumbersome for the brain to process having those words on a resume. Other things not to include, and pretty much these days this is not a problem, although 30, 40, 50 years ago you'd see this information. So personal information like your height, weight, having a photograph, your marital status, religion, social security number, date of birth, etc. Federal job resumes usually require the last 4 digits of your social security number, but sometimes that's not even necessary. It is against the law in the United States for an organization to make a hiring decision based on your height, weight, looks, marital status, age, religion, those sorts of things. So you don't need to include those. And so if an employer requests those or requires those, that kind of raises some concerns because, again, it's not legal for them to require that in a job application. References. Some people maybe want to include references on the resume, but it's best to include them on a separate sheet of paper, and you would have your same heading information up at the top, your name, your address, phone number, etc., email address. And sometimes people want to say references available upon request on a resume. It's not necessary to do that. It's understood in today's society that if you're applying for a job, you should have 3 references ready to go, and you can provide those to the employer. Definitely don't include anything that's irrelevant to the job you're applying for. Make sure there's nothing inaccurate, and for sure don't fluff up the resume with false information. Don't list achievements that aren't really achievements. And a lot of times if you're not quite sure, have somebody look at it and they'll look at that and say, well, I don't know, what does that really mean, or why did you list that? I don't think that's big of a deal, or you shouldn't list that on the resume. As far as hobbies, I recommend using the word interests. Some people say you should use hobbies. I think sometimes hobbies comes across as a little bit unprofessional, but definitely if you have some interest or pursuits that are directly relevant to the job you're applying for, especially in terms of having experience doing something, then that's a good thing to do, to list on the resume. Don't include things that you're planning on doing. So for example, if you're applying for a job, a seasonal job for next summer, and you're registered or signed up for a first aid CPR class, but you haven't done it yet, don't include that on the resume, but you can mention it in your cover letter. You should, the resume should only include current things. The exception to that would be your anticipated graduation date, but you're also listing the degree you're currently enrolled in, so that's fine. Also, don't include salary requirements on a resume. Those are something that's something that's typically discussed during the job interview. This concludes Module 5, Part 1.